Thank you. The clerk call the roll, please, and don't start with Lee.
Mayor Knudsen?
Here.
District 1 Morset?
Here.
District 2 Brokaw?
Here.
District 3 Bernard?
Here.
District 4 Wyland?
Here.
District 5 O'Malley?
Here.
District 6 Purchell?
Here.
At this time, we take comments and suggestions from citizens present. If anyone's here that would like to speak to the council on any item that is not listed on tonight's agenda, any issue that may have an impact on the city or come before a future meeting, this is your chance. You can step up to the podium there and be heard. Anyone like to speak? Okay, we'll move on to consent agenda. Would you read those items, please?
To approve the regular meeting minutes of April 1st, 2009. To approve continuation of the conditional use permit for an auto body repair garage at T&T Collision, 1701 Cooley Road, with the initial conditions. The number of damaged vehicles stored outside be limited to a total of 3 and within the area designated on the application. No cars should be parked on the private property within 15 feet of the intersections at Cooley Road and 17th Street and at 17th Street and Ward Avenue to provide improved visibility for traffic. Permit review required in 3 years, April 2012.
Can you pull that one?
To approve claims for payment in the amount of $947,009.67. A detailed description is available in the clerk's office on request. To approve the issuance of a temporary Class B retailer's license to the Hudson Hockey Association to sell beer at their annual pool tournament event at 1820 Hanley Road, Hudson, Wisconsin, from April 28th to May 4th, 2009. To approve the renewal and issuance of a 6-month beer license to the Hudson Softball Association to sell beer from May 1st to October 31st, 2009 at the Grandview Park Concession Stand, 1100 Carmichael Road. To approve replacing the spiral slide at Grandview Park for a cost of $3,285.72 to be funded from the operating budget capital outlay. To approve the issuance of an amusement device license and permits to Bertha Fenner for 12 amusement devices at Dibbo's, 517 2nd Street, and to Namco Cybertainment Incorporated for the 6 amusement devices located at 520 Stage Line Road, Hudson 12 Theater. To approve amending the professional services contract with Short Elliott Hendrickson for the City of Hudson Comprehensive Plan to provide assistance to the Hudson Park Board to update their 5-year outdoor recreation plan at a cost not to exceed $7,500. To approve the request for Stipes Shows Carnival to be held at Plaza 94 Outer Parking Lot from May 7th to May 10th, 2009, contingent on the receipt of their liability insurance coverage and completion of their direct seller's sales application. To approve the request for the Ragnar Relay Race running event in Hudson at Lakefront Park, August 21st and 22nd, 2009. To authorize the police department to apply for $14,098 Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistant Grant to fund the new radio equipment. To place on file the quarterly reports of the assessor, building inspector, fire chief, police chief, and treasurer, and the Public Utility Commission minutes of April 14th, 2009, and the Joint Library Board minutes of March 9th, 2009. That is all.
Move for approval.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda. Roll call vote.
Morset?
Yes.
O'Malley?
Yes.
Wyland?
Yes.
Burchell?
Abstain.
Bernard? Yes. Brokaw? Yes.
We have 5 yeses and 1 abstention, and the consent agenda is approved. Next item is from the Plan Commission, conditional use permit to allow part of a building, enclosed drop-off area, to extend into the required setback area at 1621 Cooley Road, Groot Wasink Real Estate, Fendler Patterson Construction.
This conditional use permit would allow the proposed drop-off center for the proposed Goodwill facility to be located in the rear yard setback The rear yard setback is required to be 30 feet. The building would be set 20 feet into that, so it'd be 10 feet from the property line. Please note that the existing building is already built to the property line, and so this facility would even be further to the south than what the existing building is. Planning Commission recommends approval of the conditional use permit with the following conditions. The conditional use permit is contingent on receiving a final development plan approval. That will be reviewed within probably the next 3 weeks. Planning Commission and Council, the area extending in the required setback area is limited to 20 feet by 30 feet as shown on the plans. And the closed drop-off area will be secured during the hours the store is not open for retail sale. Planning Commission recommends approval.
Move for approval on committee recommendation.
I'll second.
There's a motion and a second to approve the committee recommendation. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say no. Motion carries and the conditional use permit is approved. Second item is final development plans for water treatment plant number 10, 31 Canary Way, south of Stage Line Road between State Trunk Highway 35 and Old Highway 35, Hudson Public Utility Commission.
Planning Commission recommends approval of the final development plans for water treatment plant number 10 at 31 Canary Way, south of Stage Line Road and east of State Trunk Highway 35, as proposed by the Hudson Public Utility Commission. It's also one of the contingencies is that there were some city engineer comments that were made in January that plans need to be amended. I believe Chuck Schwartz, our city engineer, has now received those and is in the process of reviewing those changes. I don't believe anybody from SEH is here tonight. If there's any questions I may be able to answer, I'd be pleased to try.
Move to approve on condition that those things have been met.
Motion to approve with the staff conditions met. Is there a second?
Second.
We have a second. Any discussion?
Danny, have they received a access from Stage Line yet?
Not that it's been reported to me. I know they're working on it, but well, Stage Line or through the Church of Latter-day Saints is the two alternatives that they're working on. It appears to me that the preferred alternative is to try to work with the church. That way you won't have one additional cut along Stage Line. You'll be able to use the existing cut, which is further from the intersection. So.
Maybe I could amplify a little bit on that because I saw a puzzled look. If you were to look at what would be the best picture, where's the best site plan here? Probably this one. It's called grading plan. Got the backwash pond showing down at the south. You can see the building. And you can see an 18-foot road depicted coming from the south access. That's coming through the neighborhood to the south, correct?
Yes.
Keep going. And you know, when this parcel was acquired by the water utility, the plan was not initially for it to be a large facility like this housing lots of trucks. Initially it was going to be a well that was extra well capacity without a treatment plant there and without the extra storage. And as it has taken on its current proposed form, there's a desire to have a different access. So they've been negotiating to either come in from the north off of Stage Line itself. There's some challenges with that. Maybe you can talk a little bit about those. Or from the east through the church property.
Correct.
And then the property is bordered directly on Highway 35 to the west. So with that, you know, this is a little unusual, perhaps. I don't know if it's unheard of, but we're doing final development plans. We don't have the likely final access hasn't been acquired or negotiated or whatever. So what we're approving right now is a single, relatively narrow access in from the south, and maybe Denny can amplify on that a little bit.
Well, the access has always been proposed to be through the Hudson Meadows residential subdivision. The reason the water utility is looking at an alternative access is to try to remove as much of that traffic through the residential areas to other locations, either through the church, whose facility is not heavily occupied during the weekdays, or new access off of stage line. Access off stage line would have to be at the end of the barricades, and then off to the northeast part of the city property, south of stage line, and then be a circuitous route that goes back to the southwest and then back to the, basically to achieve a grade that's usable to get to stage line road without it being too steep of a slope. So you'd have to grade it to allow the slope to be less than probably 5 or 6%. So those are the two alternatives. The reason they're looking at those alternatives is to try to reduce the traffic that would be coming in and out of Hudson Meadows to go to this facility. Jim Fry commented at the Plan Commission, he thought 2 or 3 trucks a day would probably be the norm, the general water utility trucks, and then there'd be one delivery truck for chemicals, particularly the chlorine or other types of chemicals that would be, and so hopefully there would be an alternative route that eventually would be provided to this facility. But as of right now, the access is off of Canary Way through Hudson Meadows.
Any other questions?
Should we be holding this discussion, tabling this until we know which direction to come through? Because, like you said, originally this was set up for a site that was visited. What? How often would you visit just a well?
That's not my department. I can't comment to that specifically, but Jim's here, so.
Normally, a well site is once a day, maybe twice if there's other maintenance that has to go on there.
And that would just be with a
Pickup truck.
with a pickup truck. And here we're talking about bringing in 3 or 4 larger vehicles a day, right?
No, we're talking about 3 or 4 trips in and out with a pickup truck. And then once a month, our chemical deliveries would be in there, in and out of there. We're not talking high volume traffic. There wouldn't be as much traffic there as there is at the water treatment plant 8 on O'Neill. Or we have, trucks coming in and filling up with water, that type of thing. There wouldn't be that much traffic there.
Is there any more traffic than what you have on 5th Street?
No, most of our water plant, 7th Street would be our busiest facility because there's multiple people reporting in and out of there.
Okay.
Any other questions? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. And the development plans are approved. The next item is number 3, review the conditional use permit for T&T Collision Center, auto repair and body repair garage at 1701 Cooley Road. Tom and Tammy Datweiler. Any?
Planning Commission recommends approval of the continuance of the conditional use permit for the Datweilers for the T&T Collision Center at 1701 Cooley Road, with the provisions that generally the same provisions as initially approved by the Common Council. The number of damaged vehicles to be stored outside to be limited to a total of 3 and within the area designated on the application. No cars should be parked on the private property within 15 feet of the intersections at Cooley Road, 17th Street, and Ward Avenue, 17th Street, to provide improved visibility of traffic. A review will be required in 3 years as of April 2012. One of the notes at the Planning Commission is that we will continue to monitor the parking of vehicles at the corner. Also, an issue that was raised was snow plowing, and Mr. Datweiler has promised that he would work with their snow plowing service to try to reduce the amount of snow that gets piled up at those intersections. Datweiler's are here tonight, and maybe they can answer any specific questions you may have.
Denny, I pulled it for one concern is obviously safety, and the way it's existing at 15 feet where the employees are parking, is that what it is, 15 feet?
Well, essentially, the first two stalls in the corners, that would either face north-south. If they're not parking in those first two stalls on either end, the 15-foot should be accommodated.
Those cars that are parked there now, and when it is in the winter, both situations is causing a sightline issue from oncoming traffic moving north on 17th Street. I go past there every day, and you always got to creep your car out if you're going westbound to Ward.
Are you talking about the cars that are parked on the last two facing north, or
All of those on 17th Street, and then this corner of Ward and 17th. That corner is an obstructed corner, especially in the winter. So I guess my question is, and I know there's a lot of parking back there, can you push it back 20 to 25 feet?
for everything along 17th Street?
Well, at least that corner or the first, I don't know, 50 feet. It's only going to get busier and worse with the addition of Goodwill.
So you're talking, if you're looking 50 feet, you're looking at maybe 5 parking stalls on the north end of the cars that are facing east-west on 17th Street.
Yeah.
That would be approximately 50 feet.
And would this be, I mean, this is
issue?
certainly, if it's a safety issue, we could look at it. Safety would be directly reviewed to the renewal here?
I would think so. I mean, I'm all in favor of the business, don't get me wrong, but it is going to become an increasingly worse problem with more traffic up there.
Okay, just state again what you did. You're talking 5 places to the north, so would we be here?
Yeah.
They're east-west facing?
Correct.
Yeah, they're
And-
parking this way, yeah.
And so they're faced towards Goodwill,
Towards 17th.
towards 17th Street. And you're saying those
Yeah, because
first few, 5 maybe. Now, Danny, as I drove by there today, I noticed that at the most recent restriping after the resurfacing, it might have actually been before you were there, it used to be striped a little differently. There was actually a walking path striped on there on the public right-of-way component. You see how this is drawn with the curb, but actually the way it is right now, if you drew a chalk line from curb to curb, north and south, and there is no curb in between, I think the westerly part of the parking stalls is probably more like 3 feet from the curb. And that actually might solve this problem just as well. Would be really, I think, all that parking should be back so it's off the public right-of-way, which should probably move that entire row, Randy, back 12 feet, I think.
and that would work.
I mean, they're significantly closer to the road than they would be if they weren't on the right-of-way. I'm assuming there's 15-foot right-of-way there at least, right, from the curb?
Well, the right-of-way is part of the street surface also. Typically, from the curb to what would be the property line would be approximately 13 to 15 feet.
13 to 15, and I wonder if that would be a very simple way, is just add a statement in here to say that, parking not to be on the public right-of-way. And so when it's time to resurface and stripe, it gets striped so that there's a clear line there of where it is.
Yeah, if that.
Okay, Lori?
I just wanted to add, because this has been a concern of mine for quite a while, moving that whole row back, I think, is really necessary, and it's because as traffic is coming onto 17th from Cooley, particularly when the traffic's westbound on Cooley, it's a short block, and you can't see cars turn on to 17th. So those cars coming up from Plaza 94 have a really, really blind entrance into the intersection. So I would like to see, and I know there's no curb and gutter, but I'd like to see that whole row moved back. And I don't know what that magic number is, but it's a problem. It's worse in the winter, but it's a problem even when there isn't a pile of snow.
So I don't know if you want me to table it, send it back to you, and come with a recommendation, Or we can contingently approve it on,
Well, I suggest two things. As long as they can continue to operate under their existing conditional use permit, we can postpone it and bring it back in a couple weeks. Or the alternative would be, if that wires would be agreeable, is for myself to work with them, see how moving the cars back affects their other parking and whether that becomes an issue for them. I'm willing to do it either way. Hopefully that wires would be willing to do it that way also. If something is a workable issue, then it'd be a contingent approval.
well, I'll move to approve it on contingency that you can work it out with them. If not, I want to revisit
And you
it.
want it brought back. I
Yep.
understand, yeah.
Well, let's be more specific than approve on contingency that you work it out with them. I think we need to put something to that.
Well, I believe what you're looking for is the cars to be moved off any street right away that'd be on the private property.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think so. Are you,
And do you want to refer
So,
that?
yeah,
so we have a motion from Randy to approve with the contingency that they be willing to work with you and get the parking off the street right away.
I'll second that.
And a second, Lee?
Do you want to have that come back through safety so we can review it as well?
sure.
That way we can know if we've got a resolution to the concerns.
So long as they can operate in the meantime, when does their current permit, sort of, when conditional use
No,
permit
it's-
expire? Is it expired right
No,
now?
it's not expired. It's contingent upon a re-review, so, I mean,
Okay.
it's within reason. It's a reasonable extension, in my opinion, so.
All right. Other discussion?
Would you amend your motion and second to just refer to safety, which will be meeting in 3 weeks?
Yeah. I get,
Is that okay with the second?
So what would the motion then be, Scott?
To refer this matter back to Public Safety Committee for recommendation.
but it's coming from him.
Right, to be working with Danny and the Datwellers.
That's fine.
But it would give a chance for a committee to review exactly what are the measurements here? What are we talking about? And where is the city right-of-way? Is it 13 feet or 14 feet or 15 feet? And then everybody would know.
Well, I think probably the best mental picture you get if you went across the street on Ward Avenue to the north where the retaining wall is for the sidewalk should be on the public right-of-way, and the wall should probably be on the private property. That extension would probably be the mental picture that you would.
Yeah. And the way it's drawn here on the map is probably the way it should be, but is not exactly the way it maybe has been, and that's, I suspect that precedes, because you haven't done resurfacing yet, but it's probably on your.
I'm Tom Datweiler, I'm the owner. We had the cracks filled last year, and then quality seal coating's coming in this year to restripe it and do all that.
Okay.
So whatever, I mean, I'm easy to get along with. I mean, I don't care, it just, whatever will work for you guys, I want to make
Okay.
it work too, so.
Okay, so we have a motion. Everyone clear on it? Any questions? Been changed a couple times. We're going to send it back to public safety.
Do we require any of our other parking lots to comply with the same kind of situation? Are we going to do that going forward with other individuals who may have their parking lot on, their parking spots on public right-of-ways?
Well,
I think we have to be consistent, and we should be looking at where Randy, where your business is, they're right up against the street also, and maybe we need to move some of that parking. I think we have, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. As far as the safety issue is concerned, that we should be consistent.
definitely.
I just think part of the problem here is because there is no curb and gutter.
And also we've had some,
Parking lot goes right into
we've
the
had some
road.
significant discussions about that corner as
Yep.
far as other problems with it, so maybe this is a good step.
The real problem, what I see, is if you walk out there and you get on Ward Avenue and you stand on Ward Avenue and 17th Street there at the stoplights, and you look to my parking lot is 4 feet higher than the road. You look at it, it's the road that drops. So if the road, or my parking lot was lower, or the road was higher, you wouldn't have those problems.
Yeah.
So it's a design flaw, that we all have to figure out.
Yeah. Okay, all in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Next, number 4, set public hearing date for 6:55 PM on May 4th for the application to rezone property at 653, 655, 657, and 611 Banterra Lane in town of Hudson from R1 one-family residential district to RM1 multiple family residential district, extraterritorial zoning.
Just asking for the public hearing to be set for that date and time.
Move to approve.
I have a motion to approve and a second. Any discussion?
Kenny, I do have a question of cart and horse here. Under our code, I know this is prior to a discussion about annexation. And under our code, any property brought in that's annexed is annexed as residential, I think, R1, is it not?
Well, no, our ordinance states that if this property be rezoned to RM1, multiple family residential, and then they ask for an annexation be brought in as RM1, multiple family residential.
Okay.
There's very few areas, I think we got a couple of industrial areas and a couple of commercial areas, but about 99% of the areas in extraterritorial is zoned single family. And that's essentially why everything's been brought in as single family or one family residential.
Other questions? Do we have a motion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. See you back in May. Number 3 from the Finance Committee is the applications for operators licenses.
I will recuse myself, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Morissette is recused. Staff recommendation and committee recommendation is for approval of all the operators licenses on your issue sheet.
Move for approval.
Second.
I have a motion and a second to approve. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Licenses are approved. Number 7, consider taxi service license application of Limo One LLC and schedule a public hearing date. And the Finance Committee recommended approval. Applicant was here and gave a presentation. The idea of this is more of a limo service. They bought a Lincoln Town Car. It would not be metered service. It would be prearranged trips.
Did Finance also suggest a hearing date? May 4th.
He did, May 4th.
I'll move on the recommendation of Finance.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next item is number 12, request for funding the 2001 Freightliner truck repairs. The repairs have already been done. This is a budget adjustment. The recommendation by Finance Officer and by the Finance Committee was that we take this out of our contingency fund.
So
Pardon me. Pardon me. Contingent balance.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. Number 13, proposed 2009 capital expenditures. The Finance Committee looked at this. I understand the Public Works looked at it a little bit again. This can still be amended, but we thought maybe it'd be good to bring it forward for discussion. Sounds as though the discussion is winding down. There might be a few items to be fine-tuned, so don't be surprised if this is back again. If you'd rather not approve it tonight, we can delay the whole thing a couple of weeks. That's fine, too.
I'll move to approve.
I'll second.
There's a motion and a second to approve. Any discussion on this? So what we're approving here is just short of $2 million in mostly road infrastructure maintenance and improvement. The major project is Carmichael Road Mill and Overlay for approximately $1 million. We've got a number of other larger projects. Mill and Overlay on 11th Street from Cooley Road up to Wisconsin is a high-traffic residential neighborhood carrying a arterial north-south road for the city, and it needs work, and so we'll be able to do that. But probably more importantly, I'm happy that the Public Works Committee and Tom has worked on coming up with a plan that we're going to really do some maintenance that has needed to be done. Crack filling, seal coating. I think we talked in finance might be 15% of all the roads in the city will get one or the other of those. I think, does that sound about right?
Yes, if the council would like, I can present a overhead at our next meeting, a color-coded map of exactly what will be done and where, so that you'll be able to answer any questions from any of your constituents as to what may or may not be occurring on their street or in their neighborhood.
I think that'd be great. The idea of putting this on the agenda tonight was to kind of lock in some of the numbers, not necessarily the projects. It seems as though the projects are kind of coming together now, but can still be changed. It's still flexible for a little while. So we'll get more detail. You can see a narrative description of the projects on the issue sheet here. Any questions? Discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. The budget is approved. Next item is application of Stonewood Furniture Incorporated for a Class C wine license doing business as Dolce at 106 Buckeye Street. And the Finance Committee recommended approval contingent on completion of a building and fire inspection. I understand the copy of the seller's permit and the restaurant license has already been received. What's your pleasure?
Move to approve.
Second.
Motion and a second to approve. Any discussion?
In order to qualify for the license, this will have to operate as a restaurant. Has there been any discussion at any of the committees about parking to accommodate patrons of the restaurant? As to where would they park?
I heard no discussion of parking at all. They described that it is a small facility, that they'll be serving mostly hors d'oeuvres and sandwiches and light fare like that, but they're aware of the 50% restaurant rule. There are 600 square feet interior space. Much of the patronage will be occurring on a 500 square foot patio area outdoors. Was described as relatively small operation in a small space. They're going to try it, see what happens. There is more space available in the building so that with success they may be able to expand. I presume that, maybe Denny can answer that if you're here, there's no requirement for them in the license statute to provide additional on-street parking or off-street, is there?
Well, the city has established an exemption for the first 6,000 square feet of the building area now in downtown Hudson. Never has these applications been referred to my department. Never. For those types of reviews.
It also sounded like most of the traffic they're expecting is walk-up traffic from boaters, from the marina, from people downtown was the impression I received from them.
It's just that parking is so limited there.
It's very true.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a small parking row of west-facing head-in parking that's directly to the east of the southern end of Lakefront Park. I mean, recently the marina had a big semi-trailer parked there for a few
South
weeks.
of Buckeye Garage,
South of Buckeye Garage.
which
Yeah.
could potentially be used by marina users.
Anybody could use that, and it isn't
Yeah.
typically full
No, it is.
year-round. Maybe seasonally it fills up.
It does fill up seasonally, because parents will park there to take their kids to the lakefront park. It's free parking there, which is very handy. I'm just concerned about, you're half a block from a major intersection, a lot of traffic going through, and if we had a lot of cars parking out on the street, it might cause a problem. I'm not trying to obstruct their license application, but parking is very, very limited at this location, and I thought there might have been some discussion about how to handle it.
Well, I think the parking issue may play as part of the result of where this restaurant fails or succeeds also, so.
Well, let's hope they succeed.
Well, I do too, but again, there's no parking. I don't know where they provide, I mean, otherwise you're denying because it doesn't have parking. There's no parking on site, there's no parking on the street, so, I mean, it's an issue that's really not going to change
I think it'll,
regardless, so.
it's like other areas of the city, if we end up with a congestion area, it'll end up in safety to say we've got to stripe areas or take care of some other, if we do end up with parking issues.
Well, let's say that they are successful, and I'm hypothesizing here, but let's say that they are successful and they do wish to expand. As I understand it, premises are licensed. If they expand the premises, will they have to come back for license review?
I would make that a contingency of the approval.
Good idea.
They would have to, their premises will be described in the license that is issued, so if they wanted to expand that, it would have to come.
That's what I thought, yeah.
Okay. And with a building permit on a restaurant expansion also comes some study of impact fees and things like that. for
Sewer connection
hookup,
fee.
Sewer connection,
Correct.
those kinds of things. It wouldn't just go, it wouldn't happen without anyone knowing it was happening.
Call the question.
Question's been called. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. The license is approved with the contingent on the building and fire inspection. Number 16, review costs and approve a 3-year contract for supplemental insurance for fire department volunteers and employees. I think this is a good program. It's something that we put in the budget this year. Chief Fry sought out even better insurance. Finance Committee recommended that we approve the bid from Provident with the prepaid premium option for 3 years coverage, $14,227. To be done as a prepaid expense. A third of it will go to each budget year.
So moved.
Motion is to approve.
Second.
And a second. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion's passes. Number 17 is approve the 2009 budget for Public Works and Parks seasonal employees. The staff recommendation is to approve the proposed part-time budget plan. Finance Committee also recommends approval. Any questions on what you've got? You want me to go through it or Tom Zuli to go through it? Let me give you a brief overview. There's 3 sections to this. The top section, if you looked at the spreadsheet on page 2, backside of your issue sheet, the top section are essential things we've done each and every year. Doing them again this year. In some cases, Tom has a different plan for how he's allocating manpower. And in some cases, we're doing things a little differently as far as, like with the lifeguards, the hours are changing a little, which is going to reduce the number of hours budgeted. So that comes to 4,500 hours at the top section. The second section is where it reflects the savings coming from having bid out the lawn mowing for the parks and trails and public buildings this year. And so you can see that we aren't doing park mowing, so that's gone from 1,400 hours down to 0 hours. We aren't doing public works mowing. Well, there's a little bit left there for one building that we're going to do. And then the next part and the significant part of the second is that we've allocated 2,000 hours each for parks and public works, total of 4,000 hours. And that is to be used on the list of tasks that you've got then attached here, to be determined by the department and prioritized as they see fit. But a lot of these are either things that have been done each year, should have been done each year, or were on a wish list to get done and weren't getting done each year. And we're going to see how much of those we can get done with this amount of labor. You can see it's about equivalent, maybe a little bit more than last year. It's a little hard to tell this. They've worked hard on this in Public Works and Parks Department to try to sort this out. But we feel like there's everything that's been getting done for sure will still get done with that plan. And then the third part is down below. There is a grant that's coming through the Wisconsin what's it called? Workforce. It's like the state job service, used to be aligned with job service. But anyway, it's a jobs program. They've received federal, they do this each year, but last year they had something like 12 jobs countywide. This year they're hoping to they have funding for 50 jobs countywide. And our plan is to apply for 6 of those jobs. These are for young people, typically between 18 and 24. In some cases younger than that. And then the plan is to team those people up with some of our more experienced seasonal workers, create crews to go out and tackle some of these jobs. There's a preference for green tasks, and we've got a number of those, including trail improvement, parks development projects. There's quite a few green projects. So we feel like we put together a pretty competitive grant application, so we're hopeful for that. So that's an overview of what we've got here. So we're saving a little bit of money, but a lot of the savings that came from the lawn mowing, we are also using some of that to do some deferred maintenance and things that haven't been done. Questions? We need a motion.
Move to approve.
Second.
Motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Public Works Committee and the Parks Department can still be involved in helping the staff prioritize that list of tasks. If there's certain things they feel are the highest priority, feel free to give them guidance on that, or we can talk some more about it here at the council too. Yes.
I think he needs to do some work on laptop.
Oh, when we move next, you wanted just a second.
Okay. Did you want a brief recess? Is that what you're suggesting?
That's
Yeah,
what
the
he
AV
asked.
people asked for just a minute to hook this up before moving to our next issue.
Okay. The next item on our agenda is to consider amending Municipal Code Chapter 187-19, Sex Offender Residency, Ordinance Number 6-09. We're going to have a PowerPoint presentation, and we need a little bit of time for some technical work here, so how about we have a break? How much time do you need, Lee?
He said he needed 1 minute, so we'll see
1
how
minute.
that goes. Maybe 2 minutes.
We'll recess for 2 minutes.
You're on.
Meeting.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I got just a couple of things that I would change, but.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything.
Okay, well, we'll find out.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Dean.
Before we take this item, I wonder if we should have, could I bump you for just a minute?
Yes, you can.
Chuck Schwartz is back there, and if we did his item first, he could go home.
And more importantly, we can stop paying him then.
Yeah, we can stop paying him.
Bless you.
He's the only other item left, I believe. So update on projects, Chuck?
Yes, very quickly here. Carmichael Road Mill and Overlay, we tentatively set a pre-construction meeting for April 29th. That will likely change by a day up or a day following. We're still working out that detail. Bottom line is they do want to get there first part of May and get going on that. And it'll be done by the end of July. And we'll obviously work closely with city staff, WisDOT, and to make sure we get, and the newspapers, to make sure that we get as much information as we can out there so people are inconvenienced the least amount possible. Other than that, it's just kind of an update on some of the private developments, and things are just starting to kind of come to light and get back to spring construction. Do you have any questions for me?
Anyone have any questions for Chuck? Chuck, I haven't had a chance to tell you how happy I was with the way that Lakefront Park worked during the flood. The water came up to within about 3 inches of the top and stayed there, and we've got nice grass. We had a nice dry walking path the whole time. People were able to enjoy the park even during the high water event, which was nice.
Yeah, it was really nice when I went out there, and it was about a few inches from the top there, and people were walking along it. So yeah, I was quite pleased as well. Thanks.
All right, any questions? If not, I think, thanks a lot.
Good night.
Okay, Public Safety Committee. Take it away.
All right. As you know, we've been talking about the sexual predator ordinance. We had a subcommittee that met for a period of time. Randy and I sat there. I think we had some really good meetings, lots of lively discussion, which is good when you're working with a topic this difficult. So appreciate all our discussions, both the good ones and the tough ones. I invited Jody vaguely to come, and she'll introduce herself here, to kind of give us bring all the council up to speed at what's going on out there. She's a representative from our Department of Corrections and works on a daily basis with the sexual registry ordinance, or sexual registry. She has prepared some information for us, which I'm going to present here, with the latest studies out of a number of different places, telling us what's the latest research out there. So as we're going through our decision-making and our discussions today, we can, as much as possible, be on the same page with where a number of us have done a lot of research to get here. So with that, I'd like to have Jody do her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Like Lisa said, my name's Jody Vagley. Just to let you know who I am, why I'm here, and how I got involved in this. I do work for the Department of Corrections. This summer will be my 11th year. 10 of those 11 years I've worked with sex offenders specifically. 7 years I was a probation and parole agent in Milwaukee, Madison, and Eau Claire, and now for the last coming on 4 years I've worked with the registry. We, the Department of Corrections, got involved in the issue of residency restrictions when the legislature came to the Department of Corrections looking for information on residency restrictions when they were looking at the topic. At the time, the Department of Corrections did not have an opinion on residency restrictions. I think I know if you asked me and if you asked a lot of my superiors, we all thought, probably like everybody does in the beginning, it sounds like a great thing. But as we did our research and got information, we realized that it was not a good thing. It actually puts our communities at higher risk. And the Department of Corrections has actually, which it hates to do for political reasons, has taken a stance that they are against residency restrictions. So I got involved with this through my work with the registry, I'm here tonight. I was not planning on coming tonight as a substitute for Mike O'Keefe, who's your probation and parole supervisor. He is not able to make it tonight, so I'm a last-minute fill-in. So when I found out I was coming, I tried to compile. I have a great deal of information, both in hard copy and email, on residency restrictions. I tried to compile everything as briefly as I could for you into a PowerPoint, which my intention was to just give it to you as a handout, and then I realized that it kind of comes out kind of small in fonts. So I can talk as much or as little as you would like. I can read through it really quickly. I also provided you with testimony from Dr. Anna Salter, who is a internationally recognized expert on sex offenders, sadistic offenders, psychopaths, serial rapists. She testified in front of the Judiciary Committee on Ethics, and her testimony, I think, is a very good summary as well of all the studies that I'll be talking about. But I guess I'll just start with my PowerPoint, and I'll let you read that on your own. I think it is pretty easy to read and pretty quick, because I think when she testified it took about 2 minutes. But just some things to think about before I get into it, which is small. Again, I apologize. I'll read through this quickly. The Bureau of Justice Statistics report that nearly 2/3 of rapes and other sexual assaults occur between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m., precisely the hours when residency restrictions force transient or homeless registrants into the streets. Multiple reports that I have from different states, different individuals, different organizations, indicate that residency restrictions increase the risk factors in sex offenders, and as such increase the risks to our children, which I'll touch on briefly when I get to them. In report after report, there is no evidence that residency restrictions work, that they have any effect on recidivism. In fact, Iowa and California, which are our most recent position papers from 2008 and 2009, who have residency restrictions, are now recommending that they be repealed. A 2006 study by the Washington State's Institute for Public Policy found that sex offenders with a conviction for failure to register, which is sort of my alley, recidivate at a rate 50% higher than those who do not have such a conviction. That is something that we can make a difference in. We can work with our district attorney. If I refer someone for noncompliance with the sex offender registry, they're at a 50% higher rate of recidivating. The district attorney's office and their response to how they deal with these cases can make a difference. So, residency restrictions start out noble intentions. They are intended to protect our children and keep sex offenders out. Those were the intentions, which sound great.
Can I interrupt you for a minute? Lee, are we going to have this PowerPoint plus one that you have, or is this the only one?
No, this is the one. This has everything I had in it.
We're going to make this in 10 minutes?
Yep, I'll talk really fast.
All right, keep going.
Faster. Okay, unintended negative consequences that were discovered in Iowa, where they have a 2,000-foot residency restriction, which, by the way, they're different in just about every state. Their noncompliance rate has more than doubled. It's now tripled, so they don't know where their registered sex offenders are anymore. The registrants have disappeared. A sheriff in Lynn County, Iowa, says that we went from knowing where 90% of them were. We're lucky if we know where 50 to 55% of them are now. The law created an atmosphere that these individuals can't find a place to live. Research, decades of criminological research have identified social support and stable employment, social support, family, friends, job, work, as important factors in successful community reentry and decreased recidivism. So when you disrupt their stable factors, you increase the risk.
Hold on a second. I've lost you on the form here.
I think I did flip-flop one. I think that research one got flipped.
Okay, so there's the Lynn County.
Yeah.
You just went over that? Okay.
Yep.
Now we're on to consequences.
Okay, this is from Colorado. They did a study in 2004, which is summarized in Anna Salter's testimony. But they basically said that sex offense recidivism had no correlation to an offender's residential proximity to schools or child care centers. It's not where they live, it's how they live. And I can tell you that in the 9 years of working with sex offenders, if you go to the next slide, sex offenders do not access their victims geographically. They access them through jobs, leisure time activities, and relationships, not by where they live. And I can tell you that from personal experience. We do have a state statute in place that will restrict serious child sex offenders from working in a position where they have direct contact with minors under 16. I wish that we could legislate and prevent women with children from having relationships with registered sex offenders. That would really be helpful, but we can't do that. Next slide. Is it worth it to restrict one sex offender if you now have 20 living here that you don't know about, because it does drive them underground and we lose track of them? I'm going to keep going. Residency restrictions. Surprising opposition has come from all of these organizations, and I could add some, but the Iowa Counties Attorneys Association came up with a position paper, which I have and I've summarized. Law enforcement in those states that have residency restrictions are against them. The Jacob Wetterling Foundation, which was run by Patty Wetterling, if you remember Jacob Wetterling in Minnesota, he disappeared in 1989. His mother went to the federal government, and her foundation is the reason that every state has a sex offender registry. Patty Wetterling, who started the registries, is actually against residency restrictions. She said this has gone too far and it defeats the purpose of the registries because now we don't know where they are. The Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault has come out against them, which is summarized in here. The Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers has come out against them. The most recent ones, the Iowa Sex Offender Research Council in 2008, I believe, and I think California's was 2009, either that or I transposed them. They've come out against it. And also the Wisconsin legislature looked at the issue and voted it down. So that's opposition. Why the opposition? It is summarized both in Anna Salters and later, but basically residency restrictions are based on the myth and the fear of stranger danger. Most sexual assaults, if your child is going to be sexually assaulted, in almost 93% of the cases, it's going to be someone that you know, someone that knows your family. It is not going to be someone that goes to the park and picks them up. There's no evidence that they work. Again, it's been studied in Minnesota, Colorado. There's other studies in there from Indiana. It increases the noncompliance rate and the amount of false information that we get. It drives offenders underground. It increases their real risk factors by decreasing their stability. It puts children at an increased risk. All of this is summarized in the articles, which I'll get to later. And it stretches resources. Wisconsin is a little bit unique because the registrants are overseen by the Department of Corrections. In most other states, it's overseen by law enforcement. In the Department of Corrections, where the domino effect of residency restrictions on the east side of the state has taken place, we've actually had to add 2 specialists to Milwaukee, and we've had to reallocate one of our specialists from Madison up to the Fox Valley because the specialist noncompliance rate up there has doubled and tripled. Going forward to the next one. I'm not going to read all these. This is a summary of a very lengthy report from the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers in 2005 as to why they're against the residency restrictions. You can read that on your old time. The ones in red in all the slides are kind of the ones that are similar from all the groups. And I just want to point out that it is not very often that attorneys groups, victims groups, and treatment for sex offender groups agree on anything. So this is kind of an odd case. This is WCASA's. This is a summary of their article where I bulleted their points. The next one is Iowa County Attorneys Association. So these are going back to like 2005, 2006. There are reasons why they're against them. Basically, no evidence that shows they work. They put the kids at increased risk. I'll let you read that on your own time. Okay. Public perception, I already kind of talked about this a little bit. Stranger danger, is it fact or myth? Restrictions are basically come about as a political response to highly publicized cases in the media. Those cases that rarely happen, and when they do, they're horrible. But like I said, 93 to 95% of victims knew their perpetrator. 6 out of 10 sexual assaults took place in either the home of the victim, a family member, or a friend. If you want to go on to the next one. This is California's recent paper in 2008, which you can access at ccoso.org. They do have residency restrictions in place. This is, again, a summary of their article, which I have if you want it. But basically it says that the restrictions are based on basic assumptions that strangers pose the major threat of sexual assault. Previously identified sex offenders who commit repeat offenses are responsible for most new sex crimes, and where a sex offender lives has some direct relationship to any new sex crime. What they found was that that did not match reality. And I'm going to have to get to my slide because I can't read that up there. In only about 20% or less of sex crimes is the offender a stranger. When you look at victims under 12, which I know is what you're primarily probably concerned about, when the victim was under 12, the perpetrator was a stranger and only approximately 4% of the time. Nearly 90% of new sex crimes are committed by individuals with no previous sex offense history, and 75% or more of registered sex offenders do not commit another sex crime. Again, professionally, in my experience, when I had sex offenders come on my caseload and when I gave them polygraphs, I can't think of one instance where they did not have additional victims in their past. But after being convicted and being placed on supervision and being put through treatment and polygraphs, I only had in the last 10 years, one offender attempt to commit a new sexual assault. So supervision and treatment actually has been shown by research to work. Available research shows no relationship whatsoever between where a registered sex offender lives and the pattern of sexual assaults they commit. Again, reiterating what all those other organizations said. Their recommendation, two things. They said there's a good reason to believe that the real-world consequences of residency restrictions are actually decreasing public safety because the conditions associated with homelessness are directly associated with increased sexual recidivism. And difficult as it may be, the laws that regulate where sex offenders may not live should be repealed or substantially modified in the interest of public safety. Going to Iowa's January of 2009 very recent report, their goal, this council, their goal was to provide a nonpartisan guidance to help avoid or fix problematic sex offense policies and practices that were enacted based on emotionally laden and politically charged crimes, residency restrictions being one of them. Their recommendation, their evidence suggests that most sex offenses, which is SOs, sex offenses come to the attention of the justice system for crimes not previously adjudicated of. The majority of child victims knew the offender, so again, the restrictions would not apply to those perpetrators. And the council recommended to the General Assembly that their 2000-foot law be repealed. So what does work? What has worked? The Wisconsin Sex Offender Registry. Actually, you should be proud to be from Wisconsin. We are nationally recognized as one of the top 2 states in the nation with the top registry. Wisconsin and Florida are the best. Our compliance rate on any given day is 90% of our registrants are compliant. About 10% of them are non-compliant. The national average is 75%. So right now we know where they are. We can put on the website where they are. We get tips from the public who look on the website and tell me if they're not there. It gets investigated, so that works. What works well is law enforcement and the Department of Corrections working together. I know that Mike O'Keefe works very well with Chief Marty Jensen and Mark Richard in North Hudson, dealing with the release of sex offenders. They know about them when they're coming out. We assist in notification and community meetings. What works in the next slide is basing public policy decisions on research, which I've given you, which you can read. Corrections, us utilizing risk assessment tools to help determine who the highest risk offenders are, using treatment interventions, intensive community supervision and containment strategies. The one thing that gets left out and forgotten is teaching protective behaviors and preventing it from happening in the first place. I know that when I grew up, my parents never talked to me about my private areas and what to do if someone touched it. Thankfully, I was never sexually assaulted, but I don't know if you guys were talked about it by your parents. It just isn't being talked about. So we need to do something to try to prevent it in the first place. The next slide is just kind of what's being done now. We do have intensive supervision. We do give polygraphs. We do have chemical castration. There is an effort by our registry to work with the registrants and the probation agents to make sure that the addresses are as accurate as possible. We have a telephone tip line and email tip address on the website. The GPS is now a state law. And we also have a most wanted website. Wisconsin recidivism rate, this was for my director. If you look at Wisconsin specifically, I guess I don't know if this is must be the registered sex offenders committing any new sex offense against children. In a 3-year follow-up, the recidivism rate was 8.8. In a 5-year follow-up, 11%. In a 10-year follow-up, 15.1. The last couple slides are just examples of, in California, they have 3,000 offenders who were told that they needed to move. The next slide, in Florida, there was actually a trailer court that was outside of residency restriction where 95 at the time, I'm guessing it's 200 out of the 200 residents were sex offenders, which really isn't a good idea to cluster that many sex offenders in one trailer park together. Some final words from Iowa and California in their latest reports to policymakers, which I'll read because it's small. Over the last several years, lawmakers have been responding to several highly publicized child abduction, assault, and murder cases. While such cases remain rare in Iowa, this is from Iowa, the public debates they have generated are having far-reaching effects. Policymakers are responsible for controlling the nature of such effects. Challenges they face stem from the need to avoid responses whose primary motivation is political and the desire to make informed decisions that recognize both the strengths and limitations of the criminal justice system as a vehicle for promoting a safe and healthy family and community. From California, instead of regulating where sex offenders may live, public policy efforts should address a number of other areas that can actually have an impact on reducing the likelihood of future victimization of California's children and adults, such as the education, prevention, sex offender registries, treatment. Last one I'll go over, and then I'll be done. Residency restrictions are designed to prevent assaults by strangers, despite the fact that such crimes are relatively rare events, and that in the majority of sexual assaults, perpetrators are well known to their victims. So, food for thought. Is it worth it to increase the risk factors of most sex offenders and thereby increasing the risk of your children to enact a law that is for a small minority of sex offenders based on fear and not sound research and common sense? The next slide is just the number as of today of our registered sex offenders. And again, the Anna Salter article, I would just ask you to read that really quick. It's a wonderful compilation of all the paperwork I have. So I hope that wasn't too fast, and I hope it made sense. Do you have any questions for me, comments?
Yes.
Yes.
Lee, do you have anything else?
Basically, what I wanted to do was bring everybody up to speed at where the people that are currently, protecting our interests lie in the efforts that are being set forward, and then based on that, we look at, what do we do locally, and how can we partner with the DOC? What things can we put in here? What makes sense for us to do that will both that we feel is necessary to protect our children, as well as work hand in hand with the DOC, so we don't put in something that causes us more problems rather than gives us what we want as far as protection. So I think this is part of the heated discussion we've had on and on about where's the line? Where's the line that we take to put in the right ordinance?
Well, Jody, I thank you for coming. We started this by analyzing the Franklin and Glendale ordinance in Green Bay and many of those. And I think we pretty quickly came to the conclusion that a 2,000-foot residency restriction, while it might be constitutional, is probably bad public policy. And so that maybe wasn't unanimous, but I think it was the majority, did not support that because the risk seems so large of driving these sexual offenders underground and off the registration. Much of what you just presented is testimony coming from people who are reacting to those large 2,000 or 2,500 foot residency restriction, and really doesn't apply to what we're discussing here tonight at all, except maybe you said a dog is a dog, but some dogs bite and some dogs don't. I mean, here's the thing. I remember one night in the Public Safety Committee when I heard you say, maybe you recall this, that local communities didn't need to worry about where the placement or residency of sexual offenders under supervision were because the Department of Corrections did that. And that made a big impact on me. When I heard you say that, I later got out the Department of Corrections handbook for supervision of sexual offenders, and it very definitely talks about it's important where they live. So could you comment on that? Do you recall saying that? Or have you read that handbook?
Oh, I'm very familiar with the handbook. I actually train our agents on it. When sex offenders are getting released from prison, or if they're just coming on probation, and when the agents are considering where to place them, it is required of them by administrative directive and DOC policy for them to do a residency assessment. A large part of that is they look at the offense, how the offender accessed his victim, how did they groom the victim, who was his victim, adult, child, whatever. They go to the house, see who's living there. Are there children in the home? That's primarily the biggest factor they look at. Who's in the home? Are there children there? And if there's children there, are they able to be protected? How many bedrooms are in the house? How many bathrooms? They contact DHS to find out if there's any licensed or certified daycares in the area. And they also do drive around and, I'm sorry?
Why would they contact DHS to see if there's any licensed daycares in the area if it makes no difference where they reside? You just presented a whole bunch of information that says it makes no difference where they reside. I think that's probably the crux of the issue here. If somebody at DOC wrote that manual and everyone in DOC is following it, I asked Chief Jensen to contact Mr. O'Keefe and see what the guideline was, and he came back and said,
There is no
one
guideline.
block, don't go within a block of schools, don't live within 2 blocks of a school, that was an informal DOC. That contradicts the idea that there's no value to controlling where they reside. I'd just like to hear your response to that.
Well, it's a good question. And the department does not have a written guideline as to how far they should live from such and such a place, because they want the agent and the supervisor to look at each case individually and see what the risk factors are and how to best protect the community. So there are times when a sex offender may be placed within a block of a school. It is something that they look at. And I know that, I think, and I don't know, I'm guessing it's partly for political reasons and as a courtesy to the community that they try to prevent them from placing them within a 1 to 2 block radius of those areas. But I think if you also ask the agents and supervisors how they access their victims, it would be the same as what that says. It's through their relationships and their jobs. And we all understand that even if you move a sex offender 3 blocks away from a park or 3 miles away from a park, they still have a car, they can still walk. It doesn't matter where they live. If they're going to a park to commit an assault, they're going to do it anyway. Where they live doesn't affect that. So I guess my answer would be is it's looked at on an individual basis. Primarily the concern is who's in the home and can that child, if there's a child there, be protected, and if not, they're prohibited. They do look at park schools and things in the area, and that's examined on a case-by-case basis, but there is no policy as to how far. And like I say, I'm guessing it's political and as a courtesy.
And I think something else came up earlier which leads on to that, and that is the question of having access to your victims. If this it's part of what we've talked about in control zones, and it could be considered residency, it's a question of where that line is. But I don't believe that you want somebody sitting in a car right next to a park, because they could be having access to their victims, they could be grooming their victims, selecting their victims. Same would be true living across the street from a park. So when we talked about control zones here, where would we allow offenders to be present in grooming? Now, like Jody pointed out very clearly, 2,000 feet, you can't live here, doesn't make a lot of sense. But to me, in some of the discussions we've had, a control zone is an area where the offender is not, by our ordinance, cannot be. And if that means you can't sit and watch the park, you also can't live there and look at the park in selecting and grooming victims. Can you speak a little bit about getting access to your victims and how these people choose and get access to them?
Boy, can I speak to that? Yes. What I can say is I can reiterate, sex offenders they're very smart at being sex offenders, and they do things on purpose. If they are loitering in a park and if they're a child sex offender, or even if they haven't been convicted, they are probably there to access victims, to get to know a victim or just abduct a victim, which is why we do generally put rules on them saying they cannot, similar to your control zone, they cannot be in or loiter in parks, playgrounds, schools, because we don't want them in areas where they can have access to children to develop relationships with them and groom them and commit sexual assaults. Does that answer your question? So we are against residency restrictions, but we're in favor of control zones, child safety, however you word it.
So the point is to keep the offender away from areas in which they can access their victims.
Yes.
And
from their leisure time activities, like I said, they will become Cub Scout leaders. They will become soccer dads or moms. Not to pick on those groups because 99% of them are great people. They will become youth ministry leaders. They will date women with children because they're trying to have access to the kids. They will hang out at parks, go to the pools. So if that's what their activities are, they shouldn't be in those areas.
Okay, let's do this. If you have other questions for Jody, let's do them. Then I think we'll hear from our city attorney. We can have some general discussion, go into the ordinance a little bit and the changes that have been made. Who's got a question for Jody? Anyone? All right, thanks, Jody.
Well, I've got my memo on the legal issues. I think this is a lot different, this proposed ordinance is a lot different than what was introduced 3 years ago, from the 2,000 feet down to the 250 for residences and 150 for, we changed the terminology, it's sexual offender restricted zones. And that probably does, and this isn't a legal opinion, but does mitigate some of the research that says the 2,000, the type of residency restrictions that are onerous and virtually impossible to live with are going to have obviously the most adverse impact. But what I've tried to do is not assess the policy issues. I mean, my function is to tell you the legal issues. And what's different now than in 2006 when this first came up is we've got one case, circuit court case in Wisconsin. It's not binding. It was not appealed, so we don't have any actual law that you can follow, but it did go through the constitutional issues, and that circuit court judge did find the residency restriction constitutional. And that was, the Hudson proposed ordinance is a lot different from that, much more narrowly focused in terms of distance from areas where children tend to congregate.
Catherine, a question and germane to that point. If we go up or stay at that, I guess the question is if we go up to maybe 200 to 350, is it still narrow, or is it your opinion that it's better to leave as 150, 250?
It's hard for me to speak to that. Actually, what the judge said in that Milwaukee County Circuit Court decision is that the right distance is for the legislators, meaning you people making the law, to determine, and not for the judges. You have to look at what's best for your city, how any particular distance affects the areas where sex offenders can live within your city. So I think you have some flexibility. What's the magic number? I don't know. Certainly the closer you get to excluding them, that's a problem, both for constitutionality, I think, and for just the negative effects that you want to avoid, in other words, pushing them underground. But there's no magic number that the courts have given. The 8th Circuit Court in Minnesota, which again is not binding in Wisconsin, but upheld the Iowa law, which was 2,000 feet. Other lower courts nationally have gone different ways, but there's no magic number. You make your best assessment depending on the amount of, places where they can live. I would think a court would look favorably if you're not restricting them entirely. But there's been no law on that except affirming the 2,000 feet.
Why don't you try to hold your question so she gets the end, so she can maintain her train of thought as she goes through.
Sure.
And then we'll ask her questions.
I mean, essentially, just so everybody understands, and maybe you do, you probably do, this sets up the residence restriction 250 feet from the laundry list, parks. Actually, that list isn't quite so long. Public or private parkway, parkland, park facility, that would include private parks in subdivisions. That was a discussion, and so that was added. Public library, certain specific recreational trails that were thought to be used heavily by children, public or private playground, athletic facilities, used by children, not including golf courses, and the school forest property. So that's where the residence restriction would apply. We might need more definition on the athletic facilities used by children, simply because I don't know the city well enough to know exactly what you're referring to. And what's going to happen is the planning department will make a map of these various facilities, and if the ordinance is passed, and show the restricted areas both for residents and just the restricted areas. And so we're going to need to know what those are. And then there's the sex offender restricted zones, and what this actually says is they can't be physically present within any school, park, daycare facility, or other use defined in that 187-19C. And it also establishes, prohibits loitering within 150 feet of those same areas. So it's not exactly correct to say they can't be in that 150-foot zone. They can't be loitering within that zone. They can't be there without any specified purpose. I added language that was not in the committee ordinance because loitering ordinances have been found constitutionally defective as vague and overbroad, and so it sets up, and this is just language that's out of case law, sets up a procedure whereby the law enforcement officer needs to question or at least ask that person and before charging them with loitering. So that's what that does.
And the
Question?
Well, we should verify that intention, because the intention of the control zone ordinance was you couldn't be present in this area. It's not you couldn't loiter.
Loiter.
You couldn't be present.
Well, the term that was in the
Let me clarify
The
that.
draft was
Actually, you
loiter.
can't be present on the actual physical boundaries of the use, like in the park, and you can't loiter within
In the-
150 feet.
So if they're driving within 150 feet,
No, outside of 150 feet. Was the intention of the control zone ordinance said that you can't be, you have to be outside of the 150-foot boundary, and you can't be loitering around the boundaries. So that the intention was that if Marty was to come up and run a person and say, hey, you are a sexual predator, you can't be in this park, you need to leave.
it does that for being on the property of the park, school, daycare, those uses. But within that the zone, the 150-foot zone around those uses, the draft said loitering, it prohibited loitering. So if you want something different.
Well, that wasn't the intention.
Okay.
The intention was within that 150 feet, you couldn't be present.
Excuse me, Lee, but that would mean if I were driving, if a sex offender were driving down First Street
Yeah.
to go through town, he would pass in front of Lakefront Park within 150 feet. I think you need to keep loitering. I mean, that's just a person driving to go to work or driving to go shopping or something.
I agree. I think,
Yeah,
Lee,
that
that's
would
the
be
only way it made sense. And I thought it always made sense to have some restriction. So otherwise, you have to make a map of what streets you can drive on and can't.
Well, we're on page 5 of your draft work here, and I would say that 3 lines below that, where you use the word, I'm sure this is from case law, where the word indolently is used, that should be struck because indolent means wanting to avoid work, and I don't think it pertains to what we're doing here. But moving slowly, walking slowly with frequent stops and pauses certainly does. That's loitering. The word indolent, I think we could strike, but I think we need to keep loitering rather than
Oh, okay.
just
I
being
think
within
that was from an
150 feet.
ordinance.
Because as if a person's riding their bike through town, you're gonna pass by a park sooner or later. As long as you keep on, just on moving,
Right,
I don't
right.
think there's a problem. But
That was
loitering,
my
I mean, stopping,
understanding.
getting off your bike,
But then you have the argument, and I guess to go back to Marty, somebody looks over and says, oh, I know that person, I've seen them on the registry, call the police. Now you have to determine whether they're loitering or not.
Well,
And if they're there picnicking, are they loitering? And are they also grooming?
But
no, they're not in the park when we're talking about loitering.
they're,
Talking about 150 within 100.
Yeah.
All right, I'm sorry, yep.
Police officers deal with that situation every single day. They're deciding whether you're speeding, and do they have enough evidence to charge you and get a conviction? And it's really not any different. I mean, they'll have to make a call whether they're going to charge and write a citation.
Well, and the scenario that Lee set up may very likely happen, but a registered offender may be in the park, but that is for, under this ordinance, under its current draft, a family reunion, and notification has been sent to Chief Jensen ahead of time, and he has reviewed and approved it. So he may still get a phone call from someone who says, I recognize that offender in this
Right,
park.
but they're already
but that
pre-approved.
person would have permission.
Right.
All right, well, we were going to try.
Go ahead,
not
sorry.
to-
Okay, that was,
It's all
anyway, that's okay, really. I mean, as
Too
we go
late.
through it. The exceptions for the restricted zone areas they're taken from some other ordinances, and they're designed to, okay, if the property owner where one of these uses is, where there's another use as well as the enumerated uses, they can provide permission, and under certain circumstances, they can be on that property. Just in thinking about this, I also realized, since the municipal court is in the library, in the municipal building, there will need to be some sort of exception for that. If someone is present at municipal court, required to be present at municipal
Couldn't you
court.
combine that where they're compelled to be in a
Yep,
jail
yep,
or?
yep. It just isn't there right now, and I wanted to alert you to that. And the ordinance, which is, I don't know, Green Bay has this, and I don't know if there's any others that have this appeals process, which, to the greatest extent possible, if there's common exceptions you can identify where it would not be appropriate to apply the ordinance, you want to have that in the ordinance. But this was suggested by Mike O'Keefe, I think, to allow some individualized treatment of unique circumstances that are just very difficult to predict, and so you wouldn't have an exception for them. The way the committee drafted it, it didn't have any guidelines or factors to consider in granting exceptions, and the ordinance would really need to have that. So I tried to set up these factors kind of based on similar to variances, zoning variances, so that they are unusual, they're unique. And I mean, I guess what I'm saying is this is just a draft. I haven't seen any other ordinances that include these types of factors. I put in a 4/5 vote just to make it more of an unusual situation and make sure the committee is behind it. On the temporary type situations that Scott mentioned, these were what I talked with Chief Jensen about it. He said his understanding was for a situation where someone has a family event and it would be a one-day thing, and then the police officers would know about the person being present, and there would be a specific time and stuff like that.
Catherine, I ask a question about something you did not include. In Lee's original draft, and I think we owe a great deal of thanks to Lee and the other members of the Public Safety Committee putting in the time and the effort in on this. In Lee's original draft, 187-19J included education.
Yeah.
Was that left out because it was just considered too cumbersome, or do you think that there's some restriction in case law against that?
Well, we discussed that and thought and in fact, that it wasn't appropriate to have it in the ordinance. We didn't want to put some basis for challenging the ordinance based on, well, you haven't really carried out the education component of it. And we thought that's a separate issue. Certainly education, prevention, that kind of thing is important, and the city can adopt a policy asking the police department to have education as part of its
we'll just have an education program, but we really didn't want to put it in the ordinance because we didn't want to make it, enforceability of the ordinance contingent on that. So it was specifically left out, but not to minimize the importance of that component of a law enforcement approach.
Anyone who hasn't spoken yet wish to comment? Lori?
Just a couple things. As we've been going through this process, I think the questions that we need, some of the questions we need to be asking is the ordinance defensible in the courts? And what I'm hearing from you is,
Based on what we have,
looks reasonably
it is.
defensible.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's not the 2,000-foot thing. I mean, I really cannot predict what an appellate court is going to do because the research, people don't have answers to this. What it should be reviewed on is it rationally related to a legitimate government objective? No one's going to question this is targeted towards children and protecting children is a legitimate government objective. Is it rationally related? Several courts have found yes, it is. The Milwaukee County Circuit Court said yes and said that's a pretty low standard. I can't give you any guarantees on a Court of Appeals or the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
Okay. So that's one question. The other question is it enforceable from a public safety standpoint? Marty might want to speak to that. But it seems like with as narrowly as it's been defined, it seems as though it ought to be enforceable. I think it comes down to, for the council, do we want to have an ordinance on the books? It seems like the parameters that we've put in this ordinance are not all that different from what DOC does already, as you mentioned. It's a way of formalizing it, and it's a way of giving the public some assurance that these minimum criteria would be met. I had a chance to look at the map that Denny was starting to work on, and there were two zones looked at. One was 250, one's 500. If you look at the 250, and it was, granted it was not complete, but there are large sections of the city that would still be open for residents. It's not a matter of that we're blocking out, every possible residential area. It strikes me that what we've come up with is very reasonable. I'm not saying it's a complete work as it stands tonight, but it seems like a very good point from which to make some minor modifications.
Anyone else?
Do we have a consensus from the safety committee or do we have a recommendation from them?
Well,
The draft that came out of our committee was a little different. You can the ones that are the strikeouts that are here in the modifications are from our original draft out of safety to the current one. Okay. Most of the modifications were on the legal basis and trying to identify certain areas that what's a trail, that type of thing.
Although I did want to talk about the distances to see if anybody is in favor of going a little higher.
let's do that, and we've got some maps we can look at. I think there's a lot of meat here to get through and a lot of different parameters, and you've got the kind of the legal basis, then you've got the question of enforceability, effectiveness, the risk that we're actually counterproductive, which we're trying hard not to be here, and we don't want to be driving people underground. So anyone else have comments or questions for Catherine at this point about what she presented?
Would you mind changing a couple of quick things? In the ordinance itself. Mm-hmm. In the whereases on page 1, on the paragraph second from the bottom, line 3 states, the studies seem to agree, and you're talking about how there really isn't any agreement on level of recidivism. We saw some figures from Jody, though, earlier. But the studies seem to agree that sexual assault is a vastly underreported crime. And since underreported means unreported, you can't put vastly because it's unknowable because it's unreported. I think we need to strike the word vastly. I'm sorry to seem like I'm nitpicking, but...
Well, I guess the purpose of this, I think that terminology isn't used in some of the studies, maybe referenced in the court cases, I can't remember which, but the whole one purpose of this is to support the rationale behind the ordinance.
You feel that is, because you use a qualifier again on page 3, where you say that not only are sexual offenders a threat, they are a serious threat. And do you feel that's
Okay.
needed also?
Well, I think you need, and it's not me writing the ordinance, so I'm not really, I don't have any stake in this except to the extent that some things are necessary to help support the ordinance.
Okay.
I think you need to come to the conclusion that this ordinance is necessary, or at least a key part of protecting children within your city. You need to make that finding so that you've got your legitimate government objective and you've got your rational basis for adopting an ordinance at all. And so that's the purpose of putting that right in the ordinance. The reason I mean, other ordinances have stronger whereas clauses, the one talking about the recidivism rate. And we discussed this, I discussed it with Lee and Dean, and they go both ways. And so the thought was, well, saying the rate of recidivism is high didn't seem acceptable based on the differing studies out there.
Sure.
So
I'm not trying to in any way
yeah, but I think we
cripple
need
this ordinance.
something in there. That's why I put that in.
What I am trying to do is avoid emotionally charged statements.
Well, these
that-
are not emotionally charged. They're just, there's studies out there that show this, and I think if you're going to adopt the ordinance, you need to find that that is a
I
significant
think-
threat.
Without interrupting, or I apologize
Go
because I
ahead
did
and
interrupt you. I think there are a number of proposed changes, and rather than ask Catherine if she'll accept them, we're coming to the point where you need to ask
Yeah, it's
your other
fine.
5
Right.
people here whether they'll accept them. So hold your things. We'll be able to take them up one at a time and knock them down, whatever.
I do want to add one conceptual thing here. This ordinance doesn't control underreported crime, because this ordinance is for those people who've been reported and those people who are under control.
Yeah.
Just, it is, I just want to make that point, that, that's where the education piece comes in, where you say, what's the underreported? The underreported is the people that don't know how to say, I have a problem, or I need to talk to somebody. So that's where the education piece comes in, that I really want to see a policy on education that goes with this.
Okay, well, I do too, and I think we all agree that education and prevention is important, but I felt pretty strongly that having an ordinance that says that we will provide education is
Well,
not in
and
our
I-
best interest.
And I
Yeah,
I
and I
understood
agree
that
with
from
that.
our discussion. I just want to make sure we don't lose that piece when we finalize this, that there's some policy attached to it.
Okay. You want to look at some
Well, one more comment, just that I think needs more work, is that youth center definition, because the legal definition is very broad, and we don't know what institutions or businesses, what have you, within Hudson would fall under that.
Well,
So
I
that
would
needs some
say this,
definition.
that I conceptually, I struck in a draft that I gave back to Lee, I struck all of H, the appeals process. The appeals process agreed that they eliminated you being able to reside in 98% of the city, but the appeals process has become a complete farce and a joke. I mean, they're having 5 and 6 and 7 appeals on a couple times a month basis. I don't see why we would want to write we don't do that with other than maybe some very specific zoning examples. For example, we don't write any other ordinances and then write, here's your appeals process. If you don't like the law, come and ask the chief and maybe he'll give you an exception. It seems to me it weakens it and makes it a little bit subject to challenge depending on how you're doing it. But I could be convinced, and the more I thought about it, I thought, well, why then maybe if we have the appeal, you don't have to worry about having all your definitions. We're going to keep defining and defining and redefining. If you have the appeal process, then, you know, someone who is excluded from a youth center, who really feels that's not right and they shouldn't be, could come and go through the appeals process. So do you need to keep defining and redefining? That's
going to
the
happen.
question.
That's going to happen with this type of ordinance because, I mean, it's just the nature of the beast. And just as in zoning variances, if you find you're giving exceptions for the same types of circumstances that come up, that's one way you find out what you need to, you know, craft as an actual exception from the ordinance up front. But I guess and it's not my ordinance, it's a policy decision for you guys. I originally had a similar reaction. On the other hand, this ordinance, because the distance restrictions are much narrower, I don't know offhand what Green Bay's is, but I would think the need for an exception under the appeal process would be, especially a more permanent type exception through this committee approach, would be rare, and it's intended to be rare, and that's why the considerations are, you know, unique circumstances causing extreme hardship, can't be detrimental to the public health, safety, welfare, granting this exception won't violate the purposes of the ordinance. I mean, and then it has to be this is what's proposed, 4/5 vote. The idea is it's got to be something where there's some compelling reason, and maybe you'd get input from the DOC representative as to why this person needs to be in this location, either because of family or support system. I don't know what, but it provides a little bit of that individualized circumstance. I think it helps the legal defensibility of the ordinance. I don't think it detracts, whether it's cumbersome, whether you can get people to actually participate in the committee. You know, those are all practical questions that you need to ask. I don't know the answer to those.
I'd like to answer one of your questions about Green Bay. In Green Bay, it's the 2,000 feet, isn't it, Jody? Do you know off the hand? I believe that they're 2,000 feet. The number of registered sex offenders in the city of Hudson is 6 at last count. The number up there is hundreds and hundreds of offenders. So their appeals board is called regularly because of the pressure on, you can't live in the city, and there's so many people that fall under the restriction.
Yeah.
And half of them dropped off the radar screen as soon as that ordinance was enacted, according to their own police chief. I have the transcript from the television report.
Okay, you ready to look at some maps and take up the question of the distances? Denny, you want to show us what you came up with? Let me give you the background was that, of course, the Green Bay and Franklin and some have had 2,000 or even in some cases 2,500 feet. I had proposed earlier this month 100, 200. When it went back to committee, what came out of Public Safety Committee was 150 for a restricted area and 250 for a residency restricted area. And there was a request at that meeting to map out and see what it would look like if it were 250, 500. So what Denny's going to show you is what 500 feet would look like, I believe.
Well, this was the initial working map that we started with, just simply get areas identified that were identified in the ordinance, and then show 250 or 500 feet Now, this is a pretty cluttered map that's got a lot of information on it, but basically the dark lines, round areas, are areas that would enclose the 500-foot restriction. So Lakefront Park, of course, going out of Prospect and Berkmos Park, a lot of the area along the river is restricted. You've got parks, schools, again, so there's quite a bit of restricted area in the area of the old part of Hudson, basically from approximately 17th Street back west. Again, schools, parks, YMCA. In the south area, again, public and private parks. This is the hockey arena. We didn't map that at that time. Again, daycare centers. So you can see with the 500, with both the red lines, the 250, and the blue lines, the 500.
And Denny, can you point out the open spaces where it would be permissible?
Well, basically, open area here. This would be this is a cemetery. This location be between 11th Street and 11th Street here in this neighborhood. These neighborhoods are not quite as congested with the restrictions.
In Red Cedar Canyon, is that just the 250?
Well, this is 250 and 500. We just probably
just use
there's so many things that came up in discussions. We were kind of we tried to map it a little bit better just using the 250 foot. The yellow is schools, the green are public or private parks, the blue is the library, pink is daycare facilities. In some cases, they're very limited areas. There's 1 or 2 parcels for daycare facilities. Well, we marked in red were the youth centers, and that's the difficult, and that's the reason Catherine's brought up. Catherine and I had some discussions, looked at the definition of youth centers, and it's very broad. So, to what extent are we going to define youth centers? In this case, I did, just on my own, this is the hockey arena, Phipps Center for the Arts. You look at the definition, in my opinion, any church in the city of Hudson would fall under as being defined as a youth center, because that's an area where children could congregate for various reasons.
What about dance studios?
Well, those are the things we didn't map that we came out. One of the ones I did map was SOS up by across from the municipal building, but things like dance studios, taekwondo, those types of facilities all could possibly fall under the definition of youth center. I didn't map all of those, but I raised a question. Also recreational trails became another issue. My suggestion was let's try to define 2 or 3, enumerate those, and then mark those as restricted areas. Those 3 were the trail that goes through St. Croix County Government Center, the trail that goes through Coons Hill Park, this area, and then the one that goes, through Grandview, Stone Pine.
CCH.
Yeah, basically it's a continuation of the Coons Hill, goes down Lake Wilcox, or Wilcox Pond, in this general area. This is kind of the outline of the trail. I did not map the other pathways. So there's a number of issues and definitions that my concern and expressed to Catherine was, how is the map going to be used? How often is it updated? Dependency of directory information through the Department of Human Health Services. Some of those directories are 2 or 3 months old, and when you call them up on the web pages, how are we going to maintain any information? Is it going to be maintained on a monthly basis? How dependent are we, or is the police department going to be upon this map? We can get it down as definitive as you want. It's just that, again, and some of this, and so I took one neighborhood, which basically is this neighborhood and looked at it a little more specific. Again, Will River School, St. Patrick, Trinity, churches, daycare centers, Lakefront Park, Public Library, SLS, daycare, SLS parking lot. This is the synagogue, parks, high school, part of the school forest, and getting a little more definitive is you know, have 250, you have a radius. Any of these parcels where this line would go through would become mapped. So these parcels, if the line extends into those parcels, that map actually would include any of those. So you get a much more irregular map in the end result once you start including the entire parcel that 250 foot would go through.
One of the things that came out of this is that there is a significant difference between 200 and 250, and honestly 250 seems like it does more what I thought it was going to do. When I looked at this with Lee, and I don't know, Lee, if you have a comment on that.
Well, again, if you go back to the concept of location and being able to groom victims, and the idea that you don't really want somebody living right across the street from a park where they can view and review and know what's going on all the time. So the idea was, at 200 feet, you push them to the other side of the block. 250 feet, you push them into the next block. So that was the concept, that to try to keep them from that concept of grooming and the concept of access to victims. But originally this was written as a control zone, and now we split it into control zone and residency. But the idea again was to keep them away from the ability to groom their victims. And 250 just pushed you right over that line, because a lot of our blocks are 400 feet. So this pushes you to the next street over.
One thing I haven't been able to map yet, I've contacted the St. Croix County Department of Human Services. I've not been able to get the county certified daycares. We can get the state licensed daycares, but we've not been able to get a list yet of the certified county daycares. I don't know how many more it might be, but there may be some additional mapping we need to do.
Well, one thing we talked about too was having language that says that a map will be available and be updated periodically, but the ordinance supersedes the map. In other words, if it says you can't live within so many feet of a daycare, then you can't live there, regardless of whether you could determine that from the map. I mean, do you want to talk about that?
Well, yeah, some of the court cases, that Eighth Circuit case has said even if the map did not accurately identify everything, the ordinance was still enforceable. I think as a practical matter, you're going to want to have it as close as you possibly can, because if someone actually comes to the city, asks where they can live, and the city tells them, and then they act on that, I think you're going to have a tough time enforcing your ordinance against them. So I would say, I mean, so that's why the youth center thing is so problematic, because there's just, it's almost impossible. There aren't state agencies that necessarily keep track of all that, so it might be impossible really for the city to keep on top of those types of restricted areas. But I would say it should be updated at least quarterly, and probably, well, I don't know exactly what the procedure is going to be. How is there, DOC certainly is going to be given a copy of the ordinance and the map if it's adopted, so that if they come to the city and say, where can I live, I think some effort should be made at that time to make sure there's nothing more recent since the last update of the map.
I think we have a responsibility to make the decision and make the map accurate, because if a person in good conscience comes in, selects a home, looks at where they're supposed to live, and then 3 months later you call them and say, I'm sorry, you have to move. That's unreasonable, because we haven't held up our end of the bargain to say, we've given you the best information that we have available, and we've basically told you where you could live. I don't see how that could be upheld in court, that, yeah, we didn't tell you, but you can't live there. And you didn't know any better either, because you didn't know that there was just a daycare that opened up 2 doors down the road, and neither did we.
Something I suggested that maybe it'd be another tool other than the map, and it would not need to become a part of the official ordinance, but it would be a directory of all the information, such as, the only way I can map this is call up the web page and get directories from the state. You know, we'd want to continually update those directories, make sure we've got the best information we possibly can get. Again, a new daycare gets licensed, may it be, you know, depending on the size of the daycare, we may know about it immediately. Otherwise, if it's a smaller family daycare, we may not know about it immediately.
Mm-hmm.
So what if you reverse that? You have someone who moves in, and a neighbor a block away wants to open a daycare, a licensed daycare. Then how do you?
The ordinance does not apply to a use that has been started after that person established residency.
Okay, seen enough mapping?
I think one thing the maps indicate is 250 might be the highest that we want to go.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing that you need to understand is if the line touches any part of the lot, then that lot is excluded. So what Denny's done here is, for example, this is 3rd Street. So basically, when you come around here where St. Pat's is, then go 250 feet from the lot line of St. Pat's going to the west, and basically it takes you through that first row of homes, and then the street, and then so you'd be allowed to live on the west side of 3rd Street, but not on the east side of 3rd Street. And 250 just happens to go, it runs like that to the curbs on a lot of streets. If you went a little bit further, you really, it's almost like a squaring of the number of homes. It becomes a hugely
One thing I caution on the map, we're using scales that are good for this purpose, but when you really get down to a detailed map, you're going to have to take a look at the, go to larger maps and more specific distances, because it may in just in some cases just get into the lot. Now the lot would be included in that exclusion area.
And is there any sort of logic that we apply, like, if we hit that boundary at 250 feet and you're 1 foot into a whole nother block of houses, is it included or not? I mean, are we going to make it, is there any logic we're going to apply on the boundaries?
I just going by what the ordinance says. If the line of the 250 crosses into that lot, the entire lot is part.
Well, I think we might have to actually
Say that?
make sure of what the ordinance says.
That's what it says.
This is the nearest proximity
Yeah.
from one lot to the other.
Yep.
You measure the closest part to the school or to the youth center, to the
But does
closest
it
part of
say
your
anything
property.
if any portion of a lot is, the whole property is excluded?
Yes,
What
it
it
does.
says. Yeah, it says the whole lot is excluded.
Where are we?
It, 19C2, the last paragraph.
Closest boundary.
The closest boundary line of the residence property to the closest boundary line of the school or park. Okay, so that means if it went a foot in, you'd be at 249 and it would not be allowed.
But it might be valuable to add just a little more clarification. The entire property
Right,
is
the
allowed.
entire
disallowed.
parcel is
It doesn't really.
right, disallowed, just to make that perfectly clear.
Well, All right, are you ready to take up some, I mean, this is essentially meeting as a committee of the whole here now. So, I mean, the idea is, I think, to work on this. If there's support for going forward, it would be make some changes, have a first reading, bring it back next time, I think. Is that where we're at?
Well, you could either make some changes, bring it back for a first reading. If the changes are substantive, I mean, enough, I would say wait for a first reading until the next meeting, because you don't want to have big changes between the first and second reading.
Okay. Should we take up the distance first? Randy was first crack and he said, I think, would anyone support 350 instead of 250? Am I putting words in your mouth, or is that what you said?
No, no, that's what I said, but, you know, with the clarification of the boundaries and the closest distance, you know, we can start with 250.
Okay, and then the question of the youth center, you felt like there needs to be some definition to that. Do we have a suggestion of what the change needs to be then? Who wants to not protect youth centers with this?
Can I ask a question about youth centers? Because it occurred to me when Pam, you mentioned dance studios. And I have some experience with that through my niece and at dance studios here and elsewhere. At the Phipps, for instance, she was a member of the Phipps Dance Company. I think it's incumbent upon the dance studios to do, and I think most of them do what the Phipps does and what Helmer does, which is they don't allow adults, not even parents, to be there. You don't get to go where the dancers are when they are in class. And I know that for a fact for the Phipps and for the Helmer studios that my niece was at. And I think that maybe takes care of the problem. Maybe, I mean, you may feel differently, but I wonder if youth centers are also enclosed places where it's incumbent upon we need to educate the youth center directors that best thing to do is not have adults there.
Well, remember, it's not just on the property, it's within 150 feet.
It's loitering within
Yeah.
150
Yeah.
feet.
Yeah.
The problem is the statutory definition. Any center that provides on a regular basis recreational, vocational, academic, or social service activities for persons younger than 21 years old or for those persons and their families.
Wow.
That's broad.
That's a lot of places.
And my concern is, how is the city going to know that, you know, what is a youth center within, certain things are obvious, but some are not.
Was again, like we did
A list.
You determine very specific
Right.
items and enumerate those. And
Yep.
Yeah.
you know, if something needs to be added or amended later on, you do it. But I think that's the only way you're going to be able to address it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Well,
agree.
if we had an ordinance, I mean, I guess I differ a little bit in the idea that you want to have this be so perfect. You know, if we have an ordinance that covers 90% of the situations and misses 10, we're no worse off than we are right now when we have no protection at all other than DOCs doing their best with their limited resources to and using their best discretion and judgment. You'd be at exactly that same place. If you had some youth center that didn't get on the list, or if there was no list and it simply said youth center, I guess I fail to see why you need to have everything enumerated as if by having it on there it's going to make this perfect. This is never going to be
No, it won't
perfect.
be perfect, but you will be able to tell a person, you will know as a city where your restricted zones are for residents and for loitering. With this youth center, I don't know, you can identify some, but given that broad definition,
Well,
can you identify them all? And so how are you going to enforce it?
for the control zone, is there anyone here that feels like, say, the dance studio shouldn't be a no-go zone? Or the taekwondo? Or the hockey arena? I mean, should
You've
those...
just identified those, so
Well, which
wouldn't we
youths...
do our due diligence to keep that updated?
Well,
Well, under this interpretation, a person can go bowling here in town. there's so many places you couldn't go because they periodically have youth activities, which is what they list. I mean, Catherine's absolutely right, and I think maybe the mayor may be right that if we try to parse this thing so finely, we're never going to figure that out.
So if, getting back to, I think Catherine's point is, if we can enumerate, here is a list of places that we know we want to protect, and you put them on the map.
They say they're
And
youth
if-
centers,
And
or
if
they.
something comes up later, and we say, you know what, we probably should have included that, there's no reason why we can't come back and modify the ordinance.
Well, you
But-
could do one of two things. You could keep youth center and then just keep adding to the map. But I just worry about the situations where we don't know that they exist. Someone comes in and establishes a residence. That's gonna
And
take
then
a
what?
while.
We've got a sex offender who's living close to a use, and we haven't prohibited it, which is exactly where we are here in April 2009, and most of the state is, where there is, the DOC has no rules against that. There's no state laws
Yeah, you're
against
gonna have to
it.
let it
But
go.
you
You're
also
gonna have
can't-
to let
Yeah.
it go. You won't be able to prosecute them. You won't be able to make a move. But on the other hand, look at all the places we will have clearly defined,
But why leave that ambiguity in the ordinance?
because there will always be ambiguity. You can't dice this fine enough that it becomes.
Some ordinances, instead of using that youth center thing, say dance studios, enumerate them like that.
Well, by my, I mean, as far as taekwondo and dance, I mean, to me, athletic facilities used by children includes hockey and dancing. I don't care if they're checking or pirouetting, it's athletic, and
I
Both
think we should
are
put that
Olympic
in then. I would
sports.
never call a dance studio an athletic facility.
Right.
So-
No,
So
You
I
wouldn't
think
either?
no.
if
Hmm.
we can't make it clear so that we know what it applies to, we need to
All right.
improve it.
so is that gonna be direction that there be more wordsmithing, and we're gonna need some direction here. You wanna have Catherine be the drafter
She
and
has
draft
been
up?
She has done an excellent job of drafting this. I think that would be a good thing to.
Part of
continue.
our method to our madness here was Lee kept Catherine out of this intentionally for the most part, so that we didn't run up a bunch of legal fees. After it came out of public safety last time we got Catherine involved, she made some additions and suggestions and so on, and from this point forward, I think we're gonna let her be the drafter. That way we don't have multiple versions and so on. So, okay, there's one.
So you want to include dance studios, martial arts?
And do we want to enumerate certain youth centers? What's the consensus here?
I think so, yes. I mean, one of the drafts, you didn't have a problem. A majority of the others, name them by John Gornick Arena, all those type of places.
To the extent we can name them, I mean, we can say examples
All right.
as specific, so they, at least the ordinance gives some specifics, but we don't
if-
have to make those examples exclusive.
If you can make the example, you can plot it, which means it's enforceable.
All right.
Okay, I'm gonna throw on. Are some of our local coffee shops youth centers? Local shopping areas, youth centers? I mean, there is a point at which,
It's not a program.
I don't know that they're
Well,
designated.
Activities.
Right,
No.
okay.
Provide
But I'm
on
just
a
saying, you're
regular
talking about
basis.
right.
high concentrations and, okay.
Okay,
And I'm not, go ahead.
got another one?
No.
You had a couple whereases? I wrote down vastly versus highly, and the reason I said that was vastly, you objected to vastly. I copied you this finding number E here. That was a quote from the study down below, Recidivism of Sex Offenders, published by Center for Sex Offender Management, U.S. Department of Justice, 2001. This is a quote from their bullet points in the executive study. Several studies and interviews of sex offenders support the claim that sex offender recidivism is highly underreported. That's different than Catherine's word of vastly. Is that more acceptable?
No, I'll tell you why, because if it's underreported, it means it's unreported, right? I think we can agree on that. If it's not reported,
Well,
therefore, if it's not reported, you don't know if it's big, small, or medium. You cannot know. It's unknowable.
I struggled with this. Look at G. There's official reports, as in somebody made a police report, that's officially reported, okay? And then there are other ways, as Jody talked about, she does polygraph testing, okay? That ends up being a report of a sort. If you include all those other different kinds of reports, that's where the studies have shown that it's unreported. Her testimony was that once they're treated, the unreported goes down and the reported goes down. But what has also been shown is that, boy, there's an awful lot of this that goes on before they get treatment, and I think probably some goes on after they get treatment.
Right.
But that gets to
However,
the
we are
point-
talking, excuse me for just a second, we are talking about recidivism of registered offenders. Now, if we want to let our paranoia really gallop loose, we can talk, worry about unregistered offenders, but we're talking about registered offenders who are in compliance. These are the people who are not causing the problem.
But they're not required to be supervised anymore. Let's be clear about that. They're registered, but they're not under supervision, all of them.
In any event, what you said is a correct reflection of what Jody mentioned, that people are reporting before they were apprehended and before they became reported offenders. They had indulged in this heinous activity for some time. And that once they became registered offenders, they stopped because they finally learned that it cost them something. And they got the help that they needed, they got the therapy that they needed. So I think that we are trying to talk about a recidivism rate which does not really mean anything to this ordinance. And that's why I don't like what I consider to be emotionally charged things as vastly and a serious threat to public safety. You know what? We don't know. And I think we ought to not say things we don't know.
Well, I believe the courts have upheld that in most of the appellates.
Oh, I'm not talking from a
language that
legal
was written.
standpoint, Randy.
They've made it stand that those were the words that they used.
I just think we're beating up people who are in compliance. And I think that's bullying. It's unfair of us. Can I take 60 seconds to tell you something? Yesterday after church, a small group of us were talking about the concept of the rapture. Where people who believe and who have led exemplary lives are spirited away. And somebody said, well, what if the rapture already occurred and we're the people left? And dealing with this subject certainly makes you feel that way. But I don't feel that I think we got to drain all, and we've done a really good job of it, draining all excited utterances and all emotion out of this. I mean, we're at a much better place discussing this than we were 3 years ago. And I think that we need to be vigilant to continue on that tack. The people who live here in Hudson who are registered sex offenders have, now, Chief, tell me if I'm wrong, because I haven't checked this in 2 years. They've never reoffended. I don't know if they got so much as a parking ticket. They're exemplary citizens. So let's not come down hard on these people, okay? Let's take out the emotional stuff. That's my argument about using words like vastly or serious threat.
One of my concerns when I started was I said, let's try to follow the path that's been blazed by the ordinances that have gone before and have been challenged. And an ordinance, while there's only a certain part of it goes in the code book, that's the part after the whereases are all done. When a judge comes to look at whether there was a legitimate government purpose, they will look at the whereases. And the whereases suddenly are part of the underpinnings of the support for what you got in all the ordinances.
If there is a legal requirement, I will shut up.
Well, let me work on it. I get your drift. That particular whereas I drafted, so the court has not reviewed it.
No, it hasn't.
The next whereas has been reviewed. If you're adopting this ordinance, the council is determining that restricting access and opportunity is important to protecting children in the city. So I think some language regarding threat, public safety threat concern is important. to have
Catherine,
in
I don't want to
ordinance.
take any more of the council's
Yep.
time with this issue. You decide what you think you need to do,
Okay.
okay?
I gave you another one here, number A, which also, it comes at it a little different way, but I think we could all agree that sexual assault is underreported.
Yeah,
You may
probably,
not agree
yeah.
with that, but
Probably,
I
yeah.
think
Probably.
everyone, is there any dispute about that? I mean, it's probably one of the crimes that is least often reported to the police for a variety of reasons. And, this statement, which again, I didn't write, it came from this study,
Which one?
underreporting, number A,
It's on the sheet right there.
underreporting of sexual assault contributes to underreporting of recidivism, which leads to sex offenders having a low base rate, so on. I mean, there is a problem here that we don't know. I mean, it's hard to know.
Okay, we don't know.
All right. Who else has a change? We ready to be done with this? Yes, sir.
I got to change it, but I can make a
All right.
recommendation. If you look under exceptions for sex offender restriction zones in 19G, it says they have to have written documentation to whatever school or church they want to go to and get approval. There's nothing that says they get written documentation back. Now, from my perspective, that will help our officers should they come across someone in a school that we know is a sex offender. Go, well, how do you get permission here? Well, I got it from the school. Well, where's your proof? We don't have anything. So I'd like to see written documentation back to the person that they have permission to be there.
So you, under 19G 1B,
1B.
you'd like to add the word written before approval, so it says that they give written advance notice to an individual in charge.
Yeah, see, what it does is they have to give written advance notice to the person in charge to get approval, but it doesn't say anything about getting written approval.
It should
back.
say, and obtain written approval. There
Right.
should be two
Yep.
words added there after the
These are
word
both.
and.
Yep.
Right. And I think it should be also in 2B as well, down below.
In B.
Right.
Yeah, all
To be.
those exceptions are the
Right.
same.
That way, if one of my officers comes across someone, they'll have written documentation, and then that'll take care of the problem.
Well, okay, here, the question came up about the hockey arena, and if they intentionally desired or had chosen to have someone come there that would actually need an exception, would you be in favor of broadening this from church, synagogue, mosque, temple, other house of religious worship, or other nonprofit? In other words, if they brought it, if they decided themselves that they didn't think the individual was a threat, then they could give a written exemption and they wouldn't have to go through the whole appeal process to us.
Now, that would make it much easier on my end, that for sure.
I'm asking.
Oh, for private.
Right.
It would
For
be,
private is,
Right.
it would be nonprofits that aren't churches. I mean, here you are
Just
doing
the
it for churches.
enumerated uses that are not public, private enumerated uses.
Private.
They set up an exception for.
See where that's going? That would give
Yeah.
a broader avenue for a person to
Right.
seek exception from that facility, whatever it might be.
Center, athletic facility,
Because
any
otherwise,
of
an
these.
individual, any of those places, every time their child goes there they go to watch a child do something, they're gonna have
Well,
to get permission.
No, number
This
two
only
already
applies to
exempts
children, if they have a child going there, but you're talking about a broader exception whereby a private use that's like a youth center offers activities for children could provide their own written approval
Yes.
for someone who would otherwise come under this ordinance.
Yep.
So that,
Exception
If
number
they'd have
two
private
only gives you an
exception.
exemption if your children are
right.
there. Number one is for churches, but
Mm-hmm.
the question came up about the hockey arena, and I've thought about that, and then I thought, well, how about it? I mean, if the FIPS wanted to go through their own process and they said, look, we've decided we're happy having this person here, we don't want you to exclude this person, then, should we allow them to make the written exception themselves and they're,
I already know that there's a sex offender in town that coaches kids over the age of 16 at the hockey center. And this would give them an opportunity for the hockey arena to give him an exception to be there and coach these kids, obviously not under 16, but to be on the premises without having to come through the police department every time you get an exception.
Is there a difference, I just shuffling this around, is there a difference between, in this case, attending a church service and getting written approval from the person in charge of whatever that is to attend that particular service, and being able to say any private organization can really kind of do whatever they want with their youth activities without having it reviewed by the people who, like the police department, who have a different perspective on it? I'm wondering if that exception is too broad, is where I'm going with it.
It's a very broad exception, but it's a thought I had. I wondered whether we're giving an exception for churches when we should be doing it more evenly to groups that...
Well, the reason behind this is we're government, and freedom of religious expression is a constitutional right, and so the ordinance, to recognize that, needs to have an exception for those, certainly for those. Now, you don't have to have any kind of ordinance at all,
Okay.
setting up these restrictions. So if you wanted to allow, have the private people manage it themselves.
And partly to Scott's discussion, many organizations, I'm arguing both sides of the point here just to get the points out. Many organizations do have when you check in, you will check in with your child. You, like the Giggle Factory, you sign in, you go in, you're in. A lot of organizations have specific rules about who you are, if you can be in, if you're going to be on premises and be a teacher, what background checks are done on you. So there are a series of checks already out there. So I'm arguing on both sides of it. But I'd like to hear if anybody else has a comment on Dean's thought of widening the exceptions.
It was a thought.
Well, we're really talking about getting a sort of a self-policing thing, and I can't see I can't conjure up a scenario where there would suddenly be some ring of child pornographers who would all allow each other to go. I just don't see that happening. And I think it would help Marty Jensen out tremendously. As we've been talking about this for quite some long time, it keeps coming back to me that we are creating a tremendous structure that we are going to have to constantly maintain. And this is going to be extremely labor intensive and costly. And we ought to keep that in mind.
So it gets back to the way back initial question that I think somebody asked. I think Chippewa Falls put in something similar, but they put in control zones only. They didn't put in residence restrictions. They just said you can't be in our parks and you can't be in places where you collect victims. And they made it simple.
So even as they did that, then they recognized that there are other places children congregate that they weren't protecting, but they felt like they're doing something, which is kind of my point a few minutes ago. You don't have to enumerate every last place that children congregate to be doing some legitimate good thing. Anybody else have another topic or area? Are we ready to move on with this?
On that, youth center goes by definition of state statute. Is there some reason we can't define youth center by our own definition and not refer to the state statute and enumerate very specific ones we want to protect?
No, that's certainly the option. That's what's being proposed.
I'd be a little cleaner to do it that way.
Be the most straightforward, and then you can put them on a map.
Okay, the direction I think we've got is for Catherine to redraft this, bring it back for a first reading at our March 4th meeting.
May
4th meeting, I'm sorry. And any objection to that? Randy, anything more to add?
No.
Lee?
Can we just quick go over work on the various whereas clauses, youth center idea, and this possible additional exception?
I didn't hear, was there any support for that idea of additional exception? I'm trying to make it less cumbersome for our staff was the thing.
Well, I can bring some language on it. You can decide whether you want
All
to.
right. Okay, and then I think we're ready to move on. Thanks for your patience in that. What's left here? I've got a proclamation for Volunteer Week. I do hereby proclaim April 19th to 25th, 2009 as National Volunteer Week in the City of Hudson and urge my fellow citizens to volunteer and to observe this week with appropriate programs and ceremonies recognizing those who provide these vital services. What else have I got? Any comments, communications, or items for future agendas from any alderperson? Leaf pickup dates.
You read my,
Well, I said it doesn't need to be on the agenda, we'll just announce it.
On a much happier note than what we've been discussing for the last hour. It's spring, although outside weather may belie that right now. But this Saturday begins spring leaf drop-off. 3 Saturdays in a row, starting April 25th and going to May 9th. With the intervening Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursdays, the West End Garage will be open from noon to 7 p.m. on weekdays and 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. on weekends. And for those of you lucky enough to live in the 5th District, the Garden Spot of Hudson, if you have trouble getting to the dump, give me a call. We'll get it there for you. Leaves and cut grass only, please. This year, because the experiment worked so well last fall, we will be giving free wood chips at our dump site, a reclamation site in North Hudson, just off Cratley Lane. So if you need mulch, bring your own shovel, bring your trailer, and load up. Free wood chips.
The notices went out today also on the leaves, so they should be able to get a postcard in the mail on that.
Good. Anyone else? Did you have anything else?
Wasn't that enough?
That's good. Very good. City Attorney?
Nothing.
City Administrator? We're ready to adjourn.
Move to adjourn. Second.
Motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Adjourned. Thank you.